Welcome to Unconditioned Mind. Unconditioned Mind is a podcast of Awakened, and Awaken's focus is to contribute towards gender and racial inequality. I have an exciting guest for you today, Dr. Christo Wiese, who doesn't need any introduction. Christo, you know, I'm really excited about this conversation, talking about the history of the Afrikaner economic transformation. But before we go there, I mean, when we have you, we have to hear the story of where you started and how did you become a billionaire?
Right, Nonkululeko, I was born in Uppington. I went to school there on the edge of the Kalahari. But I finished my schooling at Paarl Boys High. I then went to university at the tender age of 17. Only stayed for 1 year, went back to Uppington for 3 years, and then again came to university and started studying law. I graduated LLB in 1967. I had a very interesting university career. Because those were the years where the South African old system started crumbling. And you had the verlichters and the verkrampers. And Stellenbosch was really verkrampt, the majority, but I was one of the verlichters on the campus. And that was, I think, in many ways, people regard that as a watershed in changing the direction of South Africa, the things that happened on Afrikaans universities' campuses. A lot of people didn't notice it, but it was an interesting era in our history. After university, I was admitted as an advocate at the Cape Bar, but I didn't go into practice immediately. I stayed with Pep Stores, which was a business that was founded in Uppington in the 1960s, in a small store the size of this room. And from that one store grew probably the largest retail footprint, or one of the largest in the world.
Wow.
Altogether, today, Pep has 3,300 stores in South Africa and Southern Africa. ShopRite has over 3,000 stores, and there's something like 3,000 or 4,000 stores in Europe as well. So it became a huge business, and ShopRite today is the largest retailer on the African continent. It employs 150,000 people and is really a world-class food retail. That shortly, I mean, I didn't do that. I did it together with hundreds of thousands of other people who were committed South Africans, who were committed Africans. Now, you ask me, how did I get to what people call a billionaire, which is really not a very meaningful term, but, you know, it was like somebody once said that if he knew how difficult it would be when he started his business career, he was an academic and he started his business career. If he had known how difficult it would be, he probably would never have started. And yet, towards the end of his life, when he was in his 70s, he said when he looked back, it was amazing how easy it all was. And I think there's a very valuable lesson in that. When you're in the arena, it is sometimes very hard, very difficult. But when you look back at it, and you look at the people that you worked with, you are amazed at how relatively easy it was. People often ask of me, you know, what is the secret? I didn't start out with the objective of being a so-called billionaire. I just wanted to do something that would satisfy me, that would make me some money so that I could enjoy the good things in life, that would create opportunities for other people. And the financial rewards came almost as a side issue. But when people ask me, what is the secret? What are the magic words? I always say to them, it's a 4-letter word. It's spelled W-O-R-K. Work. If you work and you have a clear plan, you cannot do anything but succeed. And I have no other wisdom to impart except to say I have seen people, hundreds of people, thousands of people across the spectrum in South Africa, white, black, Indian, color. I've seen people coming from very poor backgrounds and that got stuck in, that were given an opportunity and that rose to great heights and got to a situation where they could afford their children to go to good schools, go to universities. It has been a remarkable experience. So I don't really know what else to say. I grew up in a business house. My father was a typical small town entrepreneur, and my mother had a little business in Uppington. My father also farmed on the side. So I grew up in a home where I understood, what business was about. And that was a tremendous advantage. And for people who do not have that kind of background, I imagine it's a little bit harder.
Yes, I can imagine. I can imagine, Christo. I mean, when you started, for instance, you, as you are saying, you never planned to build a conglomerate. And you said you started with one store. There are people who start with one store and die running that store. How did it happen that this one store multiplied to this 3,000 that we're talking about today, and to start another retailer, ShopRite, and the same thing happens? I still want to dig into this magic. What was behind that? How was that possible? Because many people don't achieve it.
Yeah, I think, Nonku, I've often been asked that question, and there is fortunately a very clear answer. It starts with leadership. The man who founded this business was a cousin by marriage of mine. He only spent 1 year at university, so he was not academically highly qualified. But he was a brilliant entrepreneur and a brilliant leader of people. And right at the beginning, he said that a business, like a human being, should live by a philosophy. And he articulated the philosophy of that business, which applies until today in 5 terms. First of all, hard work, enthusiasm, compassion, positive thinking. Those were the terms. Enthusiasm. Those were the 5 terms that he inspired people with. To take somebody who came from a not advantaged background, to make him have faith that he can do something, to think positively, to work hard, to be enthusiastic about what he's doing, and to have compassion. Even in those days of the stringent apartheid laws, the vast bulk of our employees were from previously disadvantaged communities. And in our businesses, in spite of the law, there were no differences between whether you were white, black, colored, whatever. You know, I always use the simple example. In those days, you had to have separate bathrooms. We didn't have separate bathrooms. In our business, there was a bathroom for men and a bathroom for women, and that was it. And that sort of philosophy made people stand together, work together, and prosper together.
Yeah, I suppose, I sit on the board of ShopRite and I can see that philosophy, at ShopRite today, which is why ShopRite is still the largest retailer in Africa. Let's move now and go into this history of the Afrikaner economic transformation. That, for me, is a miracle because we all know the history of the Afrikaner. You were not always at the high end of the social equality scales. You started very small, poor, some of you living in slums. And we forget that history now when you look at where the Afrikaner now. Just paint this picture for us, because we live in a South Africa where we want to see that replicated so that we can expand our economy and get the poor to also be part of the economy and so on.
That is right. And I'm one of those people who believe that although it looks like a tremendous challenge, it can easily, but very easily be achieved. But let me tell you about the Afrikaner history as I see it. After the Anglo-Boer War in 1900, the Afrikaners were in a very, very bad shape economically. Their farms were destroyed. Their women and children died by the tens of thousands in the concentration camps. The country was, to a large extent, certainly in the rural areas, destroyed. Farms were burned, houses were burned. People were very, very poor and struggling very hard. But one thing that happened in that community is there were leaders who came forward and they formed what you would call associations or clubs, the Afrikaner Fund and various others, where the people who were a little better off could put money into a pot and help those who could not help themselves to get better educated and to get started. It came from within the community. And if in South Africa we want to become the country that we should be, it has to come from the communities. It is in the community, and I see many, many examples where it is happening, with community leaders, not high up politicians, but community leaders make things change. We probably don't have enough time today for me to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is the Free Market Foundation's initiative called Kaya Land, where through contributions and donations, we give title deeds to people on the land, for the land on which their houses or shacks or whatever are built. We make them owners of their property. Now, the Free Market Foundation calculates that there are between 7 and 11 million households where people have a dwelling on a piece of land, but the land does not belong to them. It belongs to the municipality or the province or the central government. And with one pen stroke, we can change that. We can turn 7 to 11 million South Africans who never owned any property. We can turn them into property owners. That's a much better way of going about it than taking big, previously white company-owned farms and giving it to a community, but not equipping them with the knowledge and the capital to develop it properly. And we've seen many examples of that. So that sometimes, makes me almost despair. And I want to share this with you because we're all now in the World Rugby Cup frame of mind. I was there on Saturday night. And obviously we were all, screaming our heads off. I mean, as a country, there were so many South Africans. I thought half of South Africa was there. But I stood there, I was obviously very proud. But I was also sad because I thought to myself, here is a living example of what this country can do if we get our heads right. I read this morning Sia Kulisi in a speech where the president and other people who were present said, he pleads, he makes use of this country's diversity, because the diversity is our strength, as illustrated by the Springbok rugby team. So the transformation we need has to start with the acceptance that we are all in this country, we are all committed, we are all trying to make it the best country that it can be. And I often quote General Smuts, who said South Africa is a peculiar country where things are never as good as they should be, but never as bad as they could be. And we've got to cling on to that. But we have got to try to make South Africa in a modern world, try to make it as good as it should be. We have everything in our favor, everything. If we can just get inspirational leaders. It touched me, somebody just showed me a video of a little boy who happens to be black, who at one of these Springbok gatherings said that Justin Colby is his favorite. Now he's a 10-year-old boy. He said, "You are my favorite, and you inspire me." And Cheslin Colby went on stage and gave him his medal. Now, and I thought, how sad is it that our children, it's a very good thing, that they're inspired by sportsmen. But why did you ever hear children say that our leaders inspire, whether it's at a local level or at a provincial level or at central government level? Why don't we hear that? That people say, that leader, like Madiba, inspires me. That's what we need.
I'm a firm believer, Christo, that the world will not be changed by politicians. I fully agree with you that it's only the people who can change the world. I just want to go back to that Afrikaner story. Because, we look at the history of South Africa and we focus on all the negative things that happened in South Africa, right? And I think as Black people, we just hold on to that history. And I think holding on to that past is the thing that is holding us back. But we are talking about a story of the Afrikaner coming from a place of despair after that Anglo-Boer war. But instead of despairing and feeling sorry for themselves, their leaders rose up and they galvanized the people to rebuild, right? Instead of complaining. Because we often hear in South Africa talk of the slow pace of transformation. And I always ask myself, who are we complaining to? Who can really champion the transformation of Black people other than Black people themselves? And I just want to go back to that story. How did those leaders galvanize a people who had lost everything, who were in despair, to a point of rising up and rebuilding and growing strong economically as well, to have business leaders like yourself who have changed the landscape of the business scene in South Africa? How can we do that as Black people?
Well, we first got to understand, in my view, that not all Afrikaners after the Anglo-Boer War were the way you described we should be. Namely, stop blaming other people. Stop blaming the English for what they've done in our country. But roll up your sleeves and do what you can. Stand together. But there were many Afrikaners who didn't feel that way. And 50 and 60 years after the Anglo-Boer War, they still blame their own circumstances on what happened during the Anglo-Boer War. So that's the first thing that our political leaders should be unequivocal about. Turn around and say, don't blame the past. I mean, when we had this terrible fire in Johannesburg, one of the cabinet ministers said, after 30 years of ANC rule, said this is apartheid's fault, that this building burned down and killed dozens of people. If you have that kind of mentality, you can always feel sorry for yourself, but you can't build anything if you are continually looking back. And then I want to reiterate the point that Dr. Wiese made. The way out for our people who were previously disadvantaged, the way forward, inter alia, is to make use of our diversity. Make use of our diversity. I know dozens of people in business, in academia, who regularly offers help to say, let us help where we can. There where our SOEs are failing so miserably because we are appointing the wrong people, because it has become a political game. We are here to help. And it doesn't seem, in many instances, that that offer of help is accepted because there's a political bias in it all. And that is a real tragedy. And that will take we will get there, I believe, as South Africans, but it's taking us far longer than it should. I come back to my Kaya example, which is one of many, where, and that's the irony of South Africa today, with very simple things, we can very quickly make life better for millions of South Africans. Simple things, but our ideology must be right.
So, I mean, Christo, you are talking about we are stronger together, as we saw from the World Cup. And I often wonder how we can just put this past behind us, all of us, black and white, right? And realize that, I mean, for me, even as a citizen, blaming the politicians is no longer enough, because we can sit in our own houses and blaming the politicians. The reality of the situation is that we also have a contribution to make to change our country. How do we bring the black and white people together? Forget the politicians. How can we come together and to rebuild, heal the past and rebuild? Because there's still this suspicion, among ourselves, you and I, we can sit, on a board and work together and build a big ShopRite retailer. But the average person, it's not easy because there seems to be this divide, between us that is not enabling us to come together. We're always going to complain about crime because when people are outside living in poverty, they've got to find other ways to live. And remember, people are angry, and they're angry at politicians because, you need someone to blame for your circumstances. But how do we raise black and white leaders to come together and start this journey of healing the past and rebuilding together?
No, that's a very valid question, and a question that all well-meaning South Africans should be asking themselves constantly. But let me deal with one of the issues that you made, our high crime rate, which is a consequence of poverty. Here is my own take on it. The high crime rate for which poverty is blamed is a consequence of bad policing. The poverty, because let me spell out my argument for you. In Namibia, where people, if you analyze the numbers on the per capita wealth or income, Namibia is a poorer country than South Africa. The shoplifting percentage in Namibia, I was told years ago, I haven't asked Peter Engelbrecht recently, but is less than a half of what it is in South Africa. Now, how do you explain that crime in terms of shoplifting is worse in South Africa than in Namibia if what you blame is poverty? But in Namibia, there is much better policing, much better discipline, and you do not have the same level of crime. But here is the other damning statistic. If crime today in South Africa is worse than it was under apartheid, which I think we all accept it is, then it also means that since 1994, if you blame poverty, then it means people in South Africa have become poorer since 1994. So how do you make that argument? We've had a democratic government for 30 years, and we now find if crime is really a consequence of poverty, that we have grown poorer. I mean, that's not what the plan was. So we have to start with discipline, because if you do not have discipline in a home or in a community or in a country, and discipline comes from having proper law and order. That's where it comes from. People are not naturally disciplined. Everybody always talks about how disciplined the Swiss are. But we all know how the Swiss are policed. If you put the wrong paper in the wrong rubbish bin, your neighbor will come and tell you, because there is a law. And so it starts. I recently was fortunate enough to have lunch with the Prime Minister of Singapore. Now, we all know the wonderful story of Singapore. And he said at that little lunch when he made a speech, the first priority of the government, the first priority is not rejuggling the social status, whatever you want to call it. the first priority is law and order. Because without law and order, you can do nothing. Everything you try just falls apart. There are many other things that we should pay serious attention to. And hopefully, with this latest initiative of business people working together with government, those things will happen. But let me tell you something that is sad. When Zuma was president, he asked Trevor Manuel and Cyril to draw up the National Development Plan. One of the key factors in that National Development Plan was that the civil service should be professionalized. The most competent people should be appointed and professionalize the service, the entities that deliver the service. The ANC at its conference endorsed that plan. Nothing came of. Nothing. It is still catered to. You are chosen for a job, not on merit, but on your political affiliation. Now that is clearly a recipe for disaster. You can't do that. Look at the instances where here and there we chose the best people, and this is the irony. There are thousands of people from previously disadvantaged backgrounds, many of whom I meet from time to time, that are highly competent people, but they shy away from the civil service, and they certainly shy away from politics. They try to do their own thing, which is very good and helpful, but they can make a much larger contribution if they are given the right opportunity. So that's one of the quick fixes that we can have in this country, a very quick fix. But as long as we have people aiming for jobs in the civil service, not because they want to make life better for the ordinary people in our country, but because they want to make life better for themselves only. And unless we change that, we can see the results around all of us. I, don't drive so much into the country anymore, but when I do go into the country, you see these little towns that used to be wonderful little places. Here and there are exceptions. But in many instances, you just see degeneration. Things just went from bad to worse. So if we are looking for a magic wand, now magic wands in a society like ours are not plenty. But if we look for magic wands, go back to where I started with Dr Christo Wiese. Make use of our adversity. Don't see it as a problem. See it as part of the solution. When 1994 was approaching, many people asked me, Christo, are you going to stay in South Africa? And I said, I'm staying here for one reason. The reason is I believe that the majority of the people in South Africa are good people. So the good people must get up and deal with those who are not so good. And today, I can, on that point, just make this final point. Today, when people ask me, it's coming to one of your next points, Christo, what do you think of South Africa today? My stock reply is, compared to what? Because look around the world and look at the problems that other people have, the suffering, the anxiety. You want to be in one of those places rather than South Africa, because South Africa's problems are soluble. There are many places in the world where the problems are insoluble. Here, it is perfectly soluble as long as we can get rid of this negative thing of always blaming other people.
No, I agree, definitely, Christo. You know, you remind me of this Bible verse that says, where there is no vision, people perish. So when we have a country where the leaders are concerned about their own welfare, where we know that there's corruption at the highest levels, and unfortunately, corruption becomes a culture in a country where it begins to permeate all aspects, within a society. So we're talking about the small shoplifter, but crime is everywhere. I mean, you're hearing horrible stories of corruption in the private sector at alarming rates today, which is worrying because we know that the private sector and public sector have to be involved and collaborate for corruption to happen. But that corruption was happening within government. Now we are hearing horrifying stories of corruption right in the middle of private sector, where there would be projects, 100 million projects, but the project doesn't exist. This is a private sector project. So we can see now that we cannot even be talking about the poor man in the street when crime is happening at the high levels. The very people who should be rebuilding the country themselves. So I then say that I am really excited about this initiative of business, starting to collaborate with government. But we need a collaboration at a higher level, black business leaders and white business leaders, giving our country this vision that we've been waiting for our politicians to give us. Because during the time of Mandela, we had a clear vision of reconciliation, because you have to start to forgive and heal before you can rebuild. And we lost that foundation completely. We all went back to our own corners after Mandela. So we need now these leaders to rise up, not just to help government, but to help the country to rebuild and give the people the kind of vision that the country needs to move forward. So again, I ask myself, how do we get there? Because I think when we started the project of BEE, we thought that if you empower a few black business leaders and they manage to amass some capital, they will invest into the economy and expand like you did, like I did, for instance. When I was given an opportunity as a small accounting practice, my vision was always to build. I started my business with just myself and a secretary. When I left business, it was a big accounting firm with 55 partners and 1,000 people and offices all over. But we didn't have that mentality because, again, the mentality was, it is our time to eat, it is our time to eat. How can we go back to basics now and wake up as a country and realize that if we, as the few black and white business leaders, do not rise up, we don't know where our country will end.
We will have failed our country. Your story is an inspirational one. You very kindly sent me your book, and it is an inspirational story, and people take note of. But there are too many other people that have your intellect, your insight, who do not choose the difficult path. They say, no, let's just get into a position where we can pillage and, corruption. And corruption, one of the ironies is we are being punished as a country because we are very high on the corruption list. But we are punished by the countries with the corruptors list. Because in order for corruption to happen, you need a corruptee and you need a corrupter. One can't exist without the other. But we are being labeled as such a corrupt country. But they come, as we now see, with all the Zondo Commission reports and things that are coming to the fore. The corruptors came from elsewhere. And a country where law and order is a top priority, that sort of thing does not happen. I mean, again, study the history of Singapore. Our country that had nothing. I mean, they didn't even have water. And in the space of one lifetime, grown to be on a per capita basis one of the richest countries in the world. And they have no natural resources, nothing but leadership. And that's why, when you asked me the question right at the beginning, and I'm not claiming credit for that, but why did the PEP group grow into this by international standards, a huge business? Because of leadership. At the end of the day, that is what makes things happen. Again, if you study the history of Singapore, it is an amazing history. But they had a leader in Lee Kuan Yew who understood that very clear. Very clear. Human rights is fine. We all should respect it because it affects us all, whether you are rich or poor. If your human rights are disregarded, life is not pleasant. He knew that. But he also knew that if the human rights element starts taking over the law and order approach, then you are doomed. You're not going to get it right.
As we close,
People are like that now.
As we close, Christo, I mean, we're looking at the elections in 2024, and we're all just worried because, if we even look at what is happening in the local government space, I mean, if you take that chaos into the national space, I can't just imagine where that will take our country. What is your view around expectations for 2024?
Nonku, I have to qualify it immediately. As I always say to people, I sort of have come to be a bit doubtful about my own judgment because I'm an incurable optimist. And I happen to believe in South Africa. And I happen to believe in Africa, in spite of all our challenges. But for the very point that I made earlier on, compared to what? So I remained optimistic that the man in the street in South Africa will realize that we cannot carry on the way we've carried on over the last 20 years. We cannot sit there and see how people, incompetent people, are appointed, and in many instances there are thieves and corrupt people, but in many other instances they are merely incompetent, but they are appointed because of a political affiliation. And the man in the street must wake up to that. I mean, how is it ironic? How ironic is it that people protest the lack of service delivery? From time to time, there are protests, and rightly so, that turn violent. But come the election, they vote for the same people that have not delivered. So unless, come back to the point that you and I fully agree on, the cure must come from the community. There must be people, whether they are teachers or ministers of religion or community workers, that can mobilize people to say you don't have to live like this. South Africa has enough for everybody. We can be a shining country. There is no lack of wealth in this country. But if we make it difficult for businesses to invest, to grow, for foreign investment to come into our country, for foreign skills to come into our country, then we are going to continue to struggle. I was in Dubai last week. Now, one of my friends, there's a very senior retired politician who comes to Cape Town from time to time. And he said, Christo, I just can't get it. Why you people are so poor? Because look what you have to offer. What have we got to offer in Dubai? Desert, heat, and beautiful buildings. But look at what we have to offer in South Africa. Some of the most beautiful real estate in the world, in the Western Cape. The wonderful safari experiences, all the minerals in the world, etc., etc. You can go on. We've got everything. But we don't think correctly.
Thank you so much, Christo, for this wonderful interview. And you are right, it's all about leadership. And that's what I take out of this interview. We're not going to change anything until leaders rise from the people to heal our country and rebuild. We can end this episode on what we always say at Awaken. If you take time to find who you truly are, you can then start to function from your authentic power. Thank you, Christo, and goodbye.
Thank you, Nonkululeko. A great pleasure and a good day to you.